There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'll be your host, Scott, and joining me this evening for a conversation about two very dark Twilight Zone episodes, it's Brian. Pleased you could be here, Brian.
Pleased to be here, Scott. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Now, on tonight's podcast, we will be covering two more Twilight Zone episodes, Perchance to Dream and Judgment Night, which are the 9th and 10th episodes from the first season of The Twilight Zone. So, let's wake things up with a closer look at Perchance to Dream. Now, this episode was directed by Robert Florey, who just might be the most fascinating director on the Twilight Zone roster as of yet. He was a Frenchman who fell under the spell of the silver screen right at the dawn of the industry, and he eventually made his way to Hollywood. He was barely more than a kid at the time, and he worked his way through the studio system during the silent picture era. He eventually became a full-fledged director by the late 20s after some highly regarded short films he had helmed. In fact, he actually co-directed the very first Marx Brothers film, The Coconuts. A couple years later, he was actually slated to both write and direct Frankenstein, which at the time was to star Bela Lugosi as the monster. But the producer hated the makeup job that was done for Bela, and Lugosi himself resented the fact he didn't have an actual speaking part, and so very much of Florey's script was cut. Perhaps the most notable thing remaining was the climactic ending at the windmill, which did remain in what eventually became the classic film that was directed by James Whale and starred Boris Karloff, of course. Now the studio, this is Universal Studios we're talking about, Universal Pictures, tried to make it up to Florey to some extent by giving him another project to do with Bela Lugosi. No, not Dracula. It was actually a loose adaptation of the Edgar Allan Poe classic story, Murders in the Rue Morgue. I hope I did say loose adaptation, because as would come to be the case with any number of Poe stories over the next several decades, only a few actual elements from the original story would remain. The movie is mostly notable as the first film to feature Lugosi as a mad doctor, mad scientist type. It was the sort of role he would play a number of times over the next 20-plus years, up to and including the infamous Ed Wood movie, Bride of the Monster, that many here may recall being depicted in the great Tim Burton film, Ed Wood. Now, getting back to Florey, also over the next 20 years, he tended to direct a lot of what was known as second features. These were films that could vary from an hour to 90 minutes in length. They were typically the second film shown as part of a double feature. The first film would generally be the main attraction. The second film was often either an older film that was being re-released, or the sort of productions Florey was directing, lower budget films, often from a smaller studio, often genre picks, whether it be Western, detective, war, horror, and so on. Probably the best known of these little features that Florey directed were the war film God is My Co-Pilot and the film The Beast with Five Fingers. When the 1950s rolled around, Florey rolled over to the world of television, where he evolved into a far more accomplished and well-regarded director in that medium. In fact, he won the very first Directing Achievement in Television Award from the DGA in 1955. He did go on to direct 5 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and the final thing he ever actually directed was an episode of The Outer Limits. But as far as The Twilight Zone is concerned, he did direct 2 other episodes. The Fever, a real fun one, which we'll be covering later this year on the podcast, since it is from Season 1. And a Season 5 episode, I'll confess, I have completely forgotten about, titled The Long Morrow. So, the man in the director's chair already makes this a rather unique episode. But it's the man who is seated behind the typewriter that makes it downright historic, as this is the first Twilight Zone episode not written by Rod Serling. No, this was written by Mr. Charles Beaumont. An extraordinarily gifted writer born in 1929, his actual name was Charles Nutt, and after a few different pseudonyms, he did change it to Charles Beaumont some 20 years later. The first fictional short story that was ever published in Playboy, in fact, was by Mr. Beaumont. Also, you know what? Before it slips my mind, I should also add that 4 years later, Perchance to Dream was also a short story that first appeared in the pages of Playboy. It's really something that a magazine mostly known for its pictorials was also a hotbed for some exceptional literature of the day. Now, Beaumont published work in various anthologies, as did many of the mystery, science fiction, horror, and suspense writers did in that era. But Beaumont was held in such high regard by his peers for his truly boundary-pushing work, such as a short story where heterosexuality was considered taboo and stigmatized the way homosexuality was at the time. But as he turned to television and the world he could explore there, his best work lay ahead as he wrote episodes of Alfred Hitchcock and One Step Beyond. This, of course, also led him to write for The Twilight Zone. Now, it's clear that Rod Serling is the most important creative force and writer for The Twilight Zone. Now, after Serling, while I personally tend to lean towards Richard Matheson, who wrote 16 episodes, including several incredibly iconic ones, I lean towards him as being the second most important creative voice on the show. But a strong, maybe even a stronger case could be made for Charles Beaumont, who actually wrote 22 episodes of The Twilight Zone. I will not list all 22, but I will mention a few of the more well-known episodes, such as A Nice Place to Visit, The Howling Man, Long Distance Call, Shadow Play, and Living Doll. More so, Charles Beaumont's story and life were cut short, rather tragically. Even as he worked on those last several Twilight Zone episodes in 1963 and 64, he had already begun to feel the effects of an as of yet undiagnosed brain disease that caused him to age rapidly, as well as badly impacting his ability to speak, to think, to remember. It's extremely likely that friends and fellow writers like Jerry Saul ghost-wrote at least some, if not all, of those episodes, because by 1965, Beaumont was completely unable to write anything. Theories abounded as to what was the cause of his condition, but it was generally determined that he was suffering from a horrible combination of both Alzheimer's disease and Pick's disease, which was yet another disease that dealt with the rapid degeneration of one's brain. Within a couple of years, he had wasted away to a shriveled husk of what was once a man, and he died at the way too young age of 38, even though he looked as though he was 2.5 times that old at the time. So, let's shift from that shocking sadness to the rather tight cast of this episode. We start with the lead role of Edward Hall, played by Richard Conte. Conte was a stage actor in the 1930s who graduated to feature films in the 1940s, but later became relegated to mostly B-movies and TV in the 1950s. Throughout his career, his more notable roles came before the 1970s, I'm talking about, were in the Jimmy Stewart classic called Northside 777, a trucker seeking revenge in Thieves Highway, and he actually had a really nice, memorable role in a nice little piece of film noir, I recall, from the 1950s called The Big Combo. Oh, I should point out Frank Sinatra liked him and had him co-star in 2 Tony Rome PI movies that Sinatra made back in the 1960s. But even if it didn't have nearly as much screen time as any of the aforementioned parts, most audiences will know Richard Conte best from his role as Barzini in The Godfather. And since sad or macabre things seem to go hand in hand with this episode build-up I'm doing, Conte passed away in a manner not unlike his character on The Twilight Zone from a heart attack. Lastly, the role of Maya was played by Suzanne Lloyd, who, unlike most performers I profile in these casts of these episodes, she's still alive today. She acted sporadically when she could in the 1960s outside of this Twilight Zone episode. I'd probably say her most prominent work was 6 different episodes of The Saint. By the way, it was 6 different roles, not a recurring character. You'd think a woman with eyes like that would, well, anyway. Finally, I do think mentioning the actor who portrays the psychiatrist is worthwhile. That actor was John Larch. He's a former baseball player who came to acting rather late in life, his late 30s, in fact. And he still managed to amass over 170 acting credits. it would actually be hard to find a series he didn't appear in at least once in the 1960s and the 1970s. Everything from The Rifleman to The $6 Million Man. He even had parts in a couple Clint Eastwood films, such as Play Misty for Me. He's the chief in Dirty Harry, in fact. And somehow he still managed to have 7 episodes apiece on the rival nighttime soaps of the 1980s, Dallas and Dynasty. But, as I always like to try to do whenever possible, bringing it back to the Twilight Zone, Larch does appear in 2 more Twilight Zone episodes, including the incredibly iconic episode, It's a Good Life. With that, let's move to the intro for this episode, where we once again will quote Mr. Sterling himself. 12 o'clock noon. An ordinary scene, an ordinary city. Lunchtime for thousands of ordinary people. To most of them, this hour will be a rest, a pleasant break in a day's routine. To most, but not all. To Edward Hall, time is an enemy, and the hour to come is a matter of life and death. And with Mr. Sterling's intro, the tone and stakes are set for the story of Edward Hall, who staggers his way into a psychiatrist's office, dead tired, but reveals that he cannot fall asleep, or else he will die. You see, Mr. Hall has a heart condition, and he is so hot-wired and hardwired to his imagination that all it might take is one more frightening experience to kill him. And that's all his sequentially occurring dreams, or truly nightmares, have been. He describes his dreams in the woman Maya, who has been at the center of his torturously episodic sleep. From a carnival to a funhouse to an almost heart-stopping roller coaster, the cat-eyed Maya has been luring Hall closer and closer to the edge of death. And that's why he cannot allow himself to fall asleep. Believing he is beyond help, Hall goes to leave the office, but is immediately rushed back inside upon seeing that Maya is the receptionist. He believes all hope is lost, and he throws himself out the window, hurtling to a certain death. And then we step back to see the psychiatrist calling his reception into his office, for Mr. Hall fell asleep moments after entering and died. The doctor's last words being the tragic epitaph, "I guess there are worse ways to go. At least he died peacefully." And after those words, we then hear Mr. Sterling's final words as well. They say a dream takes only a second or so, and yet in that second a man can live a lifetime. He can suffer and die, and who's to say which is the greater reality? The one we know, or the one in dreams, between heaven, the sky, the earth, in the Twilight Zone? So, this was actually one of the handful of episodes I remember distinctly from my childhood, when I would stay up way later than a kid ever should. And watching this so late at night, it genuinely entered my own subconsciousness, and I too was led down nightmarish passages. Perhaps not the best thing for a child to watch shortly before drifting to sleep. Now, it occurs to me that the Land of Dreams is a place that the Twilight Zone does visit from time to time, whether it be wish-laden scenarios or horrific delusions. This is an episode that has an eerie and relentless feel to it throughout. At the dream sequences, which take up the bulk of the episode, the way they're shot, it's with very disconcerting and off-kilter angles. There's a lot of disturbing and somewhat impressionistic imagery, and what I would say is an increasingly unsettling aural quality, both the music and the general soundscape. To me, at least, it's about as creepy and chilling as any horror film that I can recall.
It's a masterclass in disorientation in the dream sequences. You see shots way removed from the protagonist, making a Hall look long and dark, scary from an off-kilter angle, as you were saying. And the real sort of performance driving the engine of this is that of Maya, the Catwoman, who we're introduced to at a circus sideshow, if you will. And she at times seems charming, at times seems devilish. And that performance, the ambiguity of it, leaves this episode open for a lot of interpretation of what those dreams may mean or what they could mean. So I like the ambiguity of it. I really enjoyed the cinematography, and some of the visuals to us probably seem tame, but probably were a lot more unsettling at the time this episode came out, but really enjoyed this episode. I particularly like the scene that sets the tone, and that is when he asked the doctor if he stared at the picture long enough, would it move? Sort of opening up the idea of what your mind is capable of, and is it real or is it an illusion? And that gives you the Rosetta Stone for the rest of the episode.
I love that you picked out that specific moment, because when I did my initial rewatch of the episode, that was the first moment that kind of brought a smile to my face, because I think it's such a great device used. And it occurred to me that if this episode had been originally made, say, 30, 40, 50 years later, a director might choose to, maybe I'll just do a slight little bit of animation here, almost imperceptible, but you think it, and that wasn't something they were really going to be capable of doing here. And I don't feel it needed to be done. It's what the character Edward Hall is saying, and the psychiatrist's reaction to it really works nicely, and it's a great tone setter for what's about to proceed. So I really enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, it was. I was going to jump in and ask you one other question too.
Sure.
I think that called into my mind all of the visions of the Catwoman are the receptionist, which we discover at the end, and all of the conversation where the story's told through flashback incorporates her, and I think that's another point that made me wonder: was this just the last woman he saw that he put into that role throughout the story of his dreams and his memory, as addled as it was at the time? Or are we to believe that there is a person who looks like that? I think, again, the ambiguity of it, that you could just say this is an addled man. And there's a brief reference that he's taking pills that the doctor calls grays. So obviously some sort of amphetamine or dexedrine, something that was popular at the time. Methadone and dexedrine, I think, were the main drugs used to sort of make people more productive and speed up. But it makes you wonder if he just latched onto her face when he came into the office, and that's the face he projected into his dreams.
That is how I would take it. I had mentioned in the intro to this episode that one of the other episodes that Charles Beaumont wrote is personally one of my favorite ones, which was called Shadow Play, which we're not going to get to for at least a year or two. And one of the basis of that things they mentioned in that episode is how the faces and people that populate this person's dream, sometimes it might be someone that they know well, and sometimes it could just be a random face. It could be just someone they saw once on a bus at one point in time. And you realize that's actually how we do create our dream factories work. You can't just create a face out of nothingness. But we've all, depending where one lives, we've all probably seen hundreds, if not thousands of faces, and we probably rework them to populate our dreams when they're not about just people that we know. Considering that we learn that the entire episode, from the moment he heads towards the couch until the very end of it, is a dream. Therefore, it would go with when he walked in, he saw her. Even if it was just out of the corner of his eye, because obviously he didn't see her dead on, because he would have reacted immediately. But somehow it was almost subliminal is not the correct terminology for it, but it almost has that effect on him. Like he maybe wasn't aware of her, but the corner of his peripheral vision caught her, and that's how she ended up in the dream. Because there was definitely a woman named Maya that he's been tortured by, but it's possible in those previous dreams that she looked like an entirely different woman. But because he just saw this woman now, that's the way she looked in the dream. What's really striking, I do agree with her performance, which kind of the way it changes throughout the episode. And which makes me say, it's interesting that she didn't get more work. That actress. I've actually noticed that a lot by going through the cast of some of these episodes, especially the actresses involved, that some of them who do really great work, and yet they didn't have the kind of careers that you would have expected them to. I feel that might be more indicative of the times than anything else, unfortunately.
It's probably an indication that the standing science fiction, quote unquote, held in popular discussion wasn't seen as esteemed a type of performance or literature or uh, entertainment as it is now. I mean, there are some breakthroughs, obviously, Bradbury and people like that, but by and large, it was sort of seen as a serialized mass entertainment genre. And I wanted to tell a little button on this story, and that is I found in my research on this episode that Mr. Beaumont's fellow writer and friend, William F. Nolan, had spoken about him and said that he believed this episode was probably based on an experience they shared at an amusement park, that they had went to an amusement park, and he discovered, at that time, that Beaumont was deathly afraid of roller coasters. That was his number one fear. And they feature prominent in this episode, the big roller coaster scene. But there was an experience where they had went into a fun house, and Beaumont became convinced the ticket taker was coming after them with a knife in the fun house. And by the time they left, the ticket taker was just standing there at the entrance and hadn't moved. But Nolan believed that Beaumont had this overactive imagination that was really activated in a fun house, in an amusement park setting.
Yeah, that's great. I had read about Mr. Nolan. I don't know if I think I was aware of part of that story, not the entirety of it. Just shifting back briefly before I get to wrapping up the episode, because we spent time talking about the performance of Suzanne Lloyd, who played Maya. I wanted to also shift over to Mr. Conti and that character of Edward Hall, because the character of Mr. Hall, we see very little of him at all as a remotely normal or composed person. Beyond his tired, even haggard appearance at the doctor's office, this is a man who's beset by fear and desperation. He's a person immediately trapped and struggling to survive. Now, there have been and will be many future Twilight Zone episodes with a person at the center fearing for his or her life. Few, if any, seem to be in that state just literally a minute or two into the story and remain that way until the end. Now, it's interesting to remember, as I mentioned earlier, Conti did a handful of noirish B pictures at the time, because this performance for me has a very noirish feel to it. In a way, it's something like the original DOA, the classic noir film about a poisoned man struggling to find out who had murdered him. So it kind of reminds me of that. It has that kind of feel to it. It's also one of the two episodes that immediately come to mind when I talk about the Twilight Zone's penchant for scary eyes. It's so much that I've actually declared it a trope for the series. And this is certainly one I'll be chalking up a little bit later about this episode. So let me wrap up the episode. Now, this is finally an episode not written by Rod Serling, but Charles Beaumont, so finally I get to fill out something different in that column. But let's get to tropes and such. Now, beyond those scary eyes I just mentioned, let's see, you've got death and the fear of death, dreams and nightmares. Now, this would be the first with what could be termed a dangerous woman, or perhaps the classic appropriate term, femme fatale, because you do have that showing up in Twilight Zone episodes. We also get the whole carnival funhouse atmosphere thing. I don't know if I've been listing driving as a trope, but I feel like it should be in here. And also the all-knowing or know-nothing doctor/psychiatrist. As for the tone, I would say this is a bit more, this has a more of a horror genre feel than most, if not all, that have preceded it. Basically, it's both disturbing and ultimately tragic. By the way, I feel as I'm been going through my columns for the Twilight Zone episodes, the phrase ultimately tragic is going to show up a lot.
For sure.
That's the Twilight Zone for you. Now, when it comes to rating the ending, which would be the death dive and subsequent reveal that he died in his sleep, it's a solid, but I'm going to say a rather obvious and inevitable ending. I doubt anyone watching the first 10 minutes was thinking Edward Hall was going to survive this episode. I'm going to give it a 7. Rating the episode, I will go up a tick from my ending rating there, because the overall episode is certainly far more than serviceable. It's actually pretty damn scary. And it doesn't really try to placate the viewer, especially when the initial shock one has when he goes out the window. So I'm going to give a 7.5 for the episode. Now, as I transition to the next one, I will paraphrase Mr. Serling. Once upon a time, there was a ship sailing from Liverpool, England to New York. It never got there, and one man on board knew why. Next, we will tell this man's story. The distinguished actor Nehemiah Persoff plays the role of Carl Lancer, a haunted man, in a haunting story called Judgment Night. This ship sails next on this podcast, and we hope you'll see it off. See, not bad. I literally used the same words, except for eliminating the word week twice, and I added the words on this podcast. I also cut the last sentence since it would be too soon to say goodnight. So I judge it a success. So let's get to Judgment Night. Judgment Night was directed by John Bram, who I discussed at some length on the previous Twilight Zone podcast, as he was the man who directed Time Enough at Last. The episode was written, yes, we're back to the main man himself, by Rod Serling, so we can go directly to the cast. We start with the lead role of Carl Hanser, who I just mentioned was portrayed by Nehemiah Persoff, who had an acting career that lasted over 50 years. He had small parts in Hitchcock's The Wrong Man and Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot. If I may be permitted to use the word funny in this instance, it's funny that he should play a Nazi in this episode, for not only was he Jewish, he even played a rabbi a number of times in his later years, in Yentl, Magnum P.I., Last Temptation of Christ, L.A. Law, Chicago Home. It goes on and on. But I will end his acting bio with one of my more common go-tos that I will link to this Twilight Zone episode. Because wait, there is going to be a fun tie into the Nazi aspect of it all. He does in fact appear in an episode of Columbo. Yes, a series I do like to bring up whenever possible. He is the murder victim in the episode Now You See Him, which featured Jack Cassidy appearing for the third time at that point as a murderer. In that episode, he's a magician, the great Santini, who's being blackmailed by his boss. And his boss, who was played by Mr. Persoff, what is it he's threatening to expose? The fact that the great Santini, who was once known as Stefan Mueller, and was a Nazi. So, speaking of Nazis named Mueller, we actually have one in this episode, played by James Franciscus, who had a lengthy career appearing as a major character in The Naked City. He was a star of his own vehicle, Mr. Novak, a series about a rather righteous and perhaps naive English teacher, and as well as a few other very short-lived series with Franciscus as the star attraction. He never appeared in another Twilight Zone episode. He did snag roles in 2 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. But let's see, can I tie him back to the Twilight Zone? Yes. He did star in the first sequel to The Planet of the Apes, which was Beneath the Planet of the Apes, released back in 1970. As some of you might already know, Rod Serling wrote the original script for Planet of the Apes. In fact, he spent well over a year blowing through anywhere from 30 to 40 drafts of that original script, which ultimately underwent rewrites from another writer, Michael Wilson, who had worked, initially uncredited due to blacklisting, on several additional screenplays of iconic films such as Lawrence of Arabia and Bridge over the River Kwai. I know I went on a bit of a tangent there, but it was Serling related, so I'll give myself a pass before I move on to the most recognizable person in the cast, and that would be Patrick Macnee as the first officer. Now, viewers are likely to recognize Macnee from any number of dozens upon dozens of TV roles over the years, be it comedies like Frasier and Coach or light dramas like Murder, She Wrote and Magnum P.I. Let's face it, he's most closely identified, and rightly so, for portraying John Steed on the classic TV series The Avengers. We're talking 161 episodes of the original series, plus 24 more when they briefly brought it back in the late 70s. Oh, you can also check a box for a Columbo appearance, as well as 2 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents that were actually both directed by Alfred Hitchcock himself. Now, can I tie him back to the Twilight Zone again? Sure. He does appear in 1 episode of Night Gallery, which was an anthology series created by, guess who, Rod Serling. I don't want to take up too much more time with the cast so Brian can get started here, but I do want to point out one more person. And that person, I'm talking about the role of the captain, Captain Wilbur. It's played by Ben Wright. Beyond having a fairly lengthy career, I just want to point out that Mr. Wright appears in another Twilight Zone episode, which also revolves around a Nazi getting his just desserts. Amazing. And now I cede the stage to Brian so he can delve much deeper into Judgment Night.
Mr. Serling's opening narration begins. Her name is the SS Queen of Glasgow. Her registry, British. Gross tonnage, 5,000. Age, indeterminate. At this moment, she's one day out of Liverpool, her destination, New York. Duly recorded on the ship's log is the sailing time, course to destination, weather conditions, temperature, longitude and latitude. But what is never recorded in a log is the fear that washes over a deck like fog and ocean spray. Fear like the throbbing strokes of an engine pistons, each like a heartbeat, parceling out every hour into breathless minutes of watching, waiting, and dreading. For the year is 1942, and this particular ship has lost its convoy. It travels alone like an aged, blind thing groping through the unfriendly dark, stalked by unseen periscopes of steel killers. Yes, the Queen of Glasgow is a frightened ship, and she carries with her a premonition of death. Now, this episode is concerning a passenger and centered around Carl Lancer. Mr. Lancer is a passenger on this ship, and he is headed to New York on an ocean liner called the SS Queen of Glasgow. He and several of the passengers are discussing the fears of possibly being targeted by U-boats, and they initially discuss wolf packs, which are a group of U-boats. This is during World War II. He can't understand why he knows things about how U-boat tactics work, and eventually is questioned by the captain, and it's determined that he can't prove his identity. But when a porter joins him in his quarters, he finds a Kriegsmarine officer's cap with Lancer's name written on it. The Kriegsmarine was the German Navy. The ship stops for repairs when the overworked engines stop, and Lancer is increasingly convinced the ship will stop at 13:15 hours, which would be 1:15 a.m. He runs through the ship, raising an alarm as the time comes. The ship is empty. When he finally locates some of the passengers, they will not abandon the ship with him, and at precisely the time a German U-boat surfaces, and it opens fire, ultimately sinking the ship, leaving no survivors. A short while later, we see Captain Lancer in his cabin aboard the U-boat with the life preserver from the SS Queen of Glasgow behind him. His second in command, Lieutenant Muller, is troubled and is having reservations about what they've done and asks if he thinks they will be damned. To which Mueller believes he is in danger from God. Lancer expresses skepticism and sarcasm. And we learn that Mueller ultimately has brought this to the attention of Lancer, and Lancer is now going to be serving in his own private hell for ordering this massacre. And the episode closes with the following narration. The SS Queen of Glasgow, heading for New York, and the time is 1942. For one man, it is always 1942, and this man will ride the ghost ship every night for eternity. This is what is meant by paying the fiddler. This is the comeuppance awaiting every man when the ledger of his life is open and examined, the tally made, and then the reward or the penalty paid. In the case of Carl Lancer, former Captain Lieutenant, Navy of the Third Reich, this is the penalty. This is the justice meted out. This is Judgment Night in the Twilight Zone. Now, Scott, as we talk about this, was this your first introduction or thought as a kid about Nazis and seeing Nazis portrayed in television and how that came about?
Well, it's funny. I think possibly my very first exposure to Nazis in popular media, as far as television or film, it's probably watching reruns of Hogan's Heroes. So it's possible my first exposure to Nazis might have been in a comedic sense. And it wasn't too long after that, because I was taking to see films at a very young age, because I was much smarter as a 4-year-old than I am 50 plus years later. So I recall within a year or two of seeing both Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles in the theater, the producers was playing on a local station, and I watched that with my mother and father and saw the Springtime for Hitler number. But also during this time, I had seen Casablanca at this point in time. And so that was one of the first serious depictions I saw of a Nazi. And the Nazis showed up on Star Trek, and I remember that. That kind of stuck in my head. And beyond that, maybe The Great Escape, I think I might have seen when I was like 8 or 9. And of course, Nazis showed up in my comic books all the time. You know, reading comics about the World War II heroes like the Invaders or the Justice Society. So Nazis frequently showed up there. So I had, some foundation for having seen Nazis before in popular media. I would say, though, that this depiction I saw on the Twilight Zone, and I probably saw this episode when I was not even 10 years old yet, this would definitely be one of the more chilling ones that I had seen at that point in time.
I found it particularly chilling, and towards the end, as the ship looks more and more deserted, and the end is coming, it's unavoidable, and he realizes it being unavoidable. And because of the nature of this, I did a little research I'll share with you. I was curious about what maybe 115 was about and why that was so particular. And I believe there's a particular verse in the Bible, Mark 1:15, that says, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." And I think that's what this is about, is repentance. And we see in the discussion among Mueller and Lancer, one of them has sorrow and is expressing regret, and Lancer has none, in that sort of coda at the end of the episode. So I think that's probably the importance of it, as I did the research, but I really appreciate it. And the filmmaking in this, you and I had talked off mic before about how they use certain things to convey they were at sea. And if you want to talk a little bit about that, about the filmmaking that gave us the sense this really was a ship out on the ocean, and convey the fear and what that was like.
Sure. While I'm sure they were able to, they actually acquired some sort of B-roll footage of a ship at sail, because I don't think that they could have managed that for their budget to actually get a ship of that nature. But what strikes me about the entire episode, number one, how extraordinarily dark it is throughout the episode, how it's shot. I mean, for a story that's not film noir, so many scenes are just completely shrouded in shadow. So you have that at work. Then you have the fog, and you pretty much throughout the entire episode, shadows and fog prevail over everything else. That's even further accentuated when they have the switching off the lights in the salon throughout the episode. Overall, what ends up happening, it ends up having a very expressionistic feel, which is probably appropriate because that is more linked to early German filmmaking, and we are dealing with a story where the main character is in fact a Nazi.
Yeah, it was really, really good filmmaking to put this in the right context, and it's one of those episodes where there's really very little light used throughout the episode. It's pretty much shrouded in darkness and mystery the entire time. Even in the previous episode we discussed, there's the contrast of the dream world and the real world. And in this, there's no breakthrough of, a glorious light or something to that effect. So much so that I think the scene between Lancer and Mueller is probably the most brightly lit scene in the show.
No, it's funny because on the ship you do have a bunch of Brits that are fairly well lit, at least briefly.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Other than maybe the briefly the scene between Lancer and the bartender, and the third party person comes in. A lot of scenes tend to be, if they are lit well, it's briefly because we're going to descend into shadows again. They make use it works for the story because obviously they have to avoid light being visible, even through the fog. So that would explain why when he goes up to see the captain, they don't have the lights on. But it's shot beautifully because everybody is framed in shadow. You can make out the features, but it's still about as dark as anything you're going to see. It's certainly the darkest thing we've seen on this show as of yet.
Right.
It's also, it seems when we do these podcasts, it just works out that way, that there's more often than not, there's interesting links between the two episodes we're talking about. Just happened to work out that way. One of the thoughts I had literally while you were describing the episode is it's interesting that we have two episodes where the main character is someone who's in a state of panic and concern and worry pretty much throughout the episode. They're disoriented. And if you look at the Richard Conte character or Persov's character here, although they're very different people, they still have that commonality between them. So I just think that's kind of an interesting thing that just happened. It just happened to work out that way, but and for very different reasons.
It is, and I thought the most striking thing for me to see was at this time frame, not that far removed from the end of World War II, knowing Rod Serling's past and his history as a multiple wounded soldier, having fought in World War II, that this episode does show a little bit of compassion towards one of the two soldiers. That there's not just all bad guys. I mean, they're bad guys, but it even shows the shades of gray between
right
and Lancer.
Yeah, I always think it's important to note as World War II and the Nazis as well are going to come up more than once on the Twilight Zone. And it's always fascinating to keep in mind how much time had passed between the end of World War II and when these episodes were both written and produced. And you realize, especially with some of the horrors of World War II, we weren't aware of until, towards the end of the war or afterwards. And, we're not up to the trials that happen. That they haven't even occurred as of yet. When you think about how close this is to World War II, it would be like if we were filming something today, it's like, oh, we're talking about an event that happened during Obama's first term. It's like that.
Right. I was contextualizing it, like thinking it's like going back in time to when Lost was on television. Like something like that. Like, it's not that far.
Right. So one of the things that this episode made me think of, and I think I've already done this on at least one or two previous podcasts, is when an episode just brings up something that I can foresee being a situation that merits discussion or that encapsulates any number of future Twilight Zone episodes. Now, there are a number of Twilight Zone episodes where the lead character is consigned to a miserable existence. Sometimes it may be deserved, sometimes it's just cruel fate. Now, I think most first think of the stories where we follow the lead, and then the punishment or final denouement, or whatever you wish to call that final twist, a final twist of the knife, you might say, is indeed revealed at the end. Think of the iconic Time Enough at Last, which we discussed on the previous podcast, or even Escape Clause, where the lead character's true punishment is revealed by the end. There you had an immortal with a life sentence, and so he must succumb to death and condemnation to hell after all. But there are other episodes where the reveal at the end is finding out we have actually just borne witness to the hell the character has been cursed with, such as here on Judgment Night. And now, if my memory serves, there are a number of episodes of this nature, whether it be done with an obvious but still fun twist, such as an episode we'll be visiting later in the first season, A Nice Place to Visit, or it's less about a twist, but just a cruel joke, such as an episode which I've already mentioned a few times and mentioned on this podcast a few times, which is Shadow Play. That's the one we're not going to get to for quite some time. Now, I find the twisty at the end ones to be somewhat or considerably more fun, but the other form where we've experienced whatever that torturous, experience is throughout the episode, and the only twist is, that's just the way it is, and that's never going to end, however you want to phrase it. that tends to be the more emotionally devastating, or at least resonant, and thus perhaps more memorable of those options, at least for me. Basically, it all comes down to a completely different way to build suspense. All methods work depending on the type of story you ultimately want to tell.
I think my final thought about this, after, excuse me, hearing you say that, is this is another, I think, shift on Serling saying it. What does it mean when we have to face the people that we're going to kill? That it's one thing to kill people when they're faceless, when they don't mean anything to us, but when he's forced to spend time amongst these people and then know those are the people he has killed, that gives him more full accounting for what he's done to him. So much so that it's not just himself by the end of the episode he's trying to save. He's trying to rally the other passengers as well. And I think that's, that's a nice twist to say, we're going to put you in this situation so you fully understand the evil you perpetrated.
Yes, again, if I'm not mistaken, I think we're going to hit upon a number, or at least a few, possibly several Twilight Zone episodes over the course of time that kind of reverse that, and whoever the usual victimizer, colonizer, antagonist would normally be, they are flipped to understand the experience from those that they have victimized, whether it be a subject of just pure murder or racism or what have you. I think it's going to come up again and again. I already have a few in mind, but since I don't remember the exact titles, I won't start to recount them here and now.
Right. And I came across in my research, my final note to the episode, if you will, is this, and I'd forgotten about it, but I remembered after reading it, is this story structure was echoed in an episode of Black Mirror, and I won't give the episode, so I won't spoil it for anyone that watches it, but you can go find that online if you want. But I mean, I think another really solid episode. Again, I think if I have a comment that I would say to our listeners to share with your friends if they're considering the podcast, if you watch this 20 years ago and you watch it now, who you are as a person has changed, and these episodes hit in a really different way. At least they're hitting me in a different way than they did from my memories. So, I mean, a great episode, and I enjoyed it.
So let me get through my little checklist here. We can go back to checking off Rod Serling as a writer. Check. So the tropes. Well, the ideas, the elements, the concepts, and just plain things in this episode that we're likely to see again and again in past or future episodes. Let's get the big ones out of the way. World War II. This is a war we'll certainly revisit a number of ways and times over the course of the next 5 seasons, which also means the Nazis. Oh, we'll be seeing members of the Third Reich more than a few times as well. Then you have, we'll put it, boats, ships, naval vessels. We also have ghosts. We have death and a hellish fate as well. The tone of the episode. I'll go with eerie and foreboding, dark and suspenseful. That's kind of the way I kind of look at this episode. I wouldn't call it ultimately tragic. Now, rating the ending, I feel it's a solid ending. As we've discussed, I'll go 7.5 on this one. I think it's deserving of that, and I would apply that to the episode as well. So we almost had 7.5s across the board, if not for that 7 I gave Perchance to Dream's ending. Hopefully our podcast will be rated higher than all my grades this evening. So with that, I'd say it is now time to lower the flag and take down the sails on this Twilight Zone podcast. Now, Brian, as always, I appreciate you joining me tonight, and I look forward to talking alongside you again in the very near future.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you, Scott.
Excellent. As for you, the listeners, the next Twilight Zone podcast, which would be in about 2 or possibly 3 weeks' time. Now, I say possibly 3 weeks as I may require a week hiatus from podcast organization assigning the next several podcasts. We'll see. In any case, the next Twilight Zone edition of this podcast will be covering the 11th and 12th episodes from Twilight Zone Season 1, we finally reach an episode connected to the great Richard Matheson, as his story was adapted by Rod Serling, and When the Sky Was Opened. Oh, and after that, the podcast will take you where you really want to be, with the 12th episode, What You Need. I hope you all join us then. Thank you, and good night.